Did Billy the Kid really die in a dark room in Fort Sumner on July 14, 1881? Or did the West keep his secret for decades? For more than a century, rumors have swirled that the most famous outlaw of the frontier didn't die that night. And the twist that keeps the rumor alive? Years later, Pat Garrett's widow told people her husband had doubts that would turn one killing into one of the West's longest-running mysteries. Stay with me. Tonight we'll walk, step by step, through the official story, the whispers, and the strange testimony that kept Billy's legend breathing long after the reports of his death. The New Mexico plains were still settling into a new, uneasy peace after the Lincoln County War. A brutal, tangled feud that left friends dead and reputations ruined. One of the war's central figures was a skinny, quick-handed kid with a grin and a name that would live forever, William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid. He'd been a rustler, a jailbreaker, and a killer by some counts. To some, he was a cold-blooded outlaw. To others, the product of a corrupt system that had pushed a boy into violence. In the summer of 1881, the kid was on the run. He had broken out of Lincoln County Jail in April after killing 2 deputies. The governor and many residents wanted him dead. Sheriff Pat Garrett wanted him captured. Garrett tracked Billy across the prairie, and the manhunt ended, according to the official record, late on a moonlit night in July at the Maxwell Ranch in Fort Sumner. The accepted story is terse and dramatic. On July 14, 1881, Garrett went to the home of Pedro Pete Maxwell, a friend of the kids, to ask where the outlaw was hiding. After speaking with Maxwell, Garrett waited in the darkened house. Billy, who was staying in another room, slipped into Maxwell's bedroom and, according to Garrett, did not recognize the man standing there. When the kid whispered, "¿Quién es? ¿Quién es?" "Who is it?" Garrett fired 2 shots. The first hit Billy in the chest. The kid dropped dead. Garrett later said the voice betrayed him. The coroner's inquest ruled the matter closed. Newspapers from around the country printed the short dispatches. Billy the Kid was dead. Photographs were taken, and a grave marked for the young outlaw. For fans of front-page drama, it was tidy, a hunted man tracked down and slain at last. But tidy doesn't always mean true. Almost immediately, the official account met resistance. Locals in Fort Sumner whispered that the body in Garrett's custody didn't look like the kid. Others said the lighting was so poor it would be impossible to tell one face from another. A deputy who had been there altered his story years later. A friend claimed Pete Maxwell had reasons to lie, and some who knew Billy best claimed the corpse lacked the certain look of the outlaw they remembered. Even Garrett's own writings were inconsistent. Sometimes he insisted he'd killed Billy and signed a letter to that effect. Other times he sounded less certain, hinting at confusion or regret. Historians have pointed to these inconsistencies and to the haste with which the inquest was assembled as reasons to question whether the narrative that took hold in 1881 was the whole story. The mystery simmered for decades, until an old man named Brushy Bill Roberts walked into the light in 1949 and declared, "I am Billy the Kid." Roberts claimed to have lived under a false name for years, that he'd been spared on that Fort Sumner night, and that he had eventually settled down in Texas. His petition for a pardon, and his long list of details about the kid's life, reignited the debate. Many people were sympathetic. Roberts offered names, places, and memories that seemed too intimate for an elaborate hoax. Others found contradictions in his story, and doubted his age and birthplace. Brushy Bill's claim didn't prove anything conclusively. Governor Thomas Mabry refused the pardon, and many researchers concluded Roberts was likely an imposter. Still, the Brushy Bill story kept asking the old, irksome question: what if Garrett had been wrong, or had wanted to be wrong? This is where the story gets darker, stranger, and more powerful. Years after the shooting, and after Pat Garrett himself was killed in 1908, a sworn affidavit emerged years later that claimed Apollonia, or Apollinaria, Garrett. Pat Garrett's widow told a childhood friend that her husband had not killed Billy the Kid. The affidavit, collected by a man named Homer Overton decades later, says Apollonia told Overton and another boy that Garrett and the kid had shot a drunk in Fort Sumner, and passed off the body as Billy S. to close the case. That claim, if taken at face value, flips the accepted story from a neat manhunt to a cover-up. Let that sink in. The widow of the man who took credit for the killing reportedly told a neighbor that her husband knew or thought he'd killed the wrong man. She suggested Garrett might have been complicit in making a corpse appear to be Bonnie. Historians treat this affidavit with caution. The events were recounted decades later by a boy who was then 9. But the testimony fed the Brushy Bill narrative and ensured the question would never fully go away. If Garrett did stage or misidentify the body, multiple motives might explain it. The frontier thirsted for closure. A governor wanted a notorious fugitive dead. Money, from bounties, hung in the balance. Garrett himself had spent months and years chasing down Billy. To many, he needed the victory for his career, reputation, and perhaps financial relief. There is also a human angle. Garrett and Billy had once been less than personal enemies, acquaintances with a complex past. Some writers have even suggested Garrett, tired of blood, might have preferred an end without a long, bloody pursuit, and engineered a way to stop the cycle. And yet, motive doesn't equal proof. The gaps in the record, the shifting testimonies, and the emotional claims from people decades removed from the events create more smoke than fire. But the smoke itself is telling. If nothing else, it shows how messy truth can be when it lives inside legend. Historians who defend the official version point to contemporaneous details. Garrett's own account, the coroner's jury, eyewitnesses like Deputy John Poe and Thomas McKinney, and the immediate burial in Fort Sumner. Archaeology and repeated attempts to reopen the case have failed to uproot the established claim. Garrett himself wrote letters later in life asserting he had indeed shot Billy. Some of his family preserved artifacts and letters confirming that stance. There's a pile of paper that supports the standard narrative. On the other hand, skeptics note, only Garrett and his deputies were sure of the identity that night. The lighting was poor, witnesses' memories varied, and the body was buried quickly. Decades later, a few testimonials, including Apollonia Garrett's alleged remarks and Brushy Bill's testimony, offered a competing memoir that suggested the story might not be finished. Which account do you accept when contemporaries disagree and time eats away at certainty? Brushy Bill Roberts presented granular knowledge, names, roots, incidents, that sometimes matched what was known about Billy's life. He claimed he survived Fort Sumner, fled and lived decades under a new name. Yet forensic questions followed him. Census records, dates of birth, and testimony didn't line up cleanly. When he finally stood before Governor Mabry in 1950, the old man faltered. He couldn't recall crucial names and failed to prove every detail. The governor denied the pardon. Roberts died not recognized as Billy the Kid. Still, Roberts found supporters. A curious public loved the drama of a fabled outlaw growing old and anonymous in a small Texas town. The tale of Brushy Bill sustained tourism, folklore, and the stubborn idea that official history sometimes gets one thing wrong for convenience. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, researchers tried new techniques. DNA comparisons and re-examinations of the supposed graves were proposed, comparing bones or relics to living relatives and known photos. There were proposals to exhume graves, and some museums acquired letters and mementos connected to Garrett that seemed to confirm his story. But exhumations are fraught, and many of the burial sites had been disturbed by floods and time. So scientists have never delivered a definitive genetic knockout punch one way or the other. The mystery remained alive, not solved. Apollonia Garrett's alleged comment that her husband had doubts is like a whisper from a century ago that refuses to be silenced. Whether she spoke literally or whether the story of her words was embellished by memory, the effect is the same. It keeps us questioning. In history, doubt is often more interesting than certainty. It invites re-examination. It forces us to look at motives, to reread letters, and to talk to descendants. If Garrett did in fact stage a deception, or if he merely believed he had killed the kid but later felt unsure, the moral is wrenching. A man who hunted a youth to the death might end his life haunted by the possibility he'd been wrong. That haunting is what Apollonia's words suggest, and it's why legend endures. So, what really happened to Billy the Kid? The clean answer would be the one printed in 1881. Pat Garrett shot and killed William H. Bonney at Fort Sumner. But history rarely offers only clean answers. We have an official record, contradictory eyewitness statements, an imposter who claimed the kid's name, and a widow's decades-later whisper that changed decades of certainty. Brushy Bill, Apollonia Garrett, the hurried inquest, and the missing or disturbed grave all make the accepted story look less like an end and more like the opening of a debate. My bet for viewers: the truth is complicated, and maybe that's why the story endures. People want mysteries. People love the idea that the kid could have escaped to live quietly in the dust. People also love the idea of brutal finality. Garrett's bullet, the grave in Fort Sumner. Both stories can be true in the same heart. One a history rooted in evidence, the other a legend rooted in longing. Which version do you believe? The official shooting in Fort Sumner, or the idea that Billy slipped away and lived on under another name? Drop your vote and your reasons below. I read every comment. If you want more deep dives into the legends that shape the West, stories that mix fact, rumor, and haunting testimony, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Next up, we'll dig into John Wesley Hardin's mysterious end, a gunfighter who, like Billy, left more questions than answers. Because in the West we tell the stories that won't stay buried. Legends never die.